July 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The war in Europe was still burning, but here, in the middle of the American heartland, it had taken on a different shape. No artillery, no bomb craters, no advancing lines on a map. Just rows of wooden barracks, barbed wire fences, and endless wheat fields stretching flat and golden to the horizon. Camp Concordia was one of many prisoner-of-war camps spread across the United States during World War II. As Allied forces advanced across Europe, tens of thousands of captured German soldiers were transported across the Atlantic, not to punishment camps, but to places like this, quiet, controlled environments designed to hold them until the war decided their fate. Boxcars rolled into the camp under the Kansas sun, carrying nearly 600 German prisoners. The doors slid open, and men stepped down in ordered lines. Officers first, then enlisted soldiers, faces thin for months of retreat and rationing, uniforms worn, boots cracked, expressions caught somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. They had crossed an ocean expecting brutality. What they found instead was silence, procedure, and waiting. Among the prisoners was a man who did not belong in any military formation. He was 7 years old. The boy stood beside his father as they disembarked, his small hand gripping a worn sleeve for balance. His name was Klaus. He said nothing. He did not cry. He did not ask questions. He simply stared at the unfamiliar brightness of the Kansas plains, squinting against a sun far harsher than the European skies he remembered. At first glance, he looked like many children shaped by war, thin, pale, quiet in a way that suggested he had learned early that noise did not change outcomes. But something about how he moved set him apart. His right arm hung stiff at his side. The hand was curled inward, fingers partially clenched, as if frozen mid-motion. He climbed down from the boxcar using only his left hand, then immediately reached for his father again, shielding his eyes from the glare with practiced instinct. That movement did not go unnoticed. Corporal James Holland stood on the loading platform, watching the prisoners arrive. He was 24 years old, trained as a combat medic, though no longer assigned to the front. Months earlier, shrapnel had torn through his left thigh during the fighting at Anzio. He walked with a slight hitch now, a permanent reminder of how suddenly bodies could be changed. Camp duty was supposed to be quieter, predictable, but Holland had learned that pain did not disappear just because the guns were far away. It simply arrived in different forms. As the prisoners formed lines and were counted, Holland's eyes followed the boy. "That kid hurt?" he asked the camp commander standing beside him. Major Daniels barely looked up from his clipboard. He had the expression of a man buried under forms, schedules, and responsibilities that left little room for curiosity. "Which one?" "The blonde one, right arm, looks wrong." Daniels squinted toward the moving line, then made a short notation. "I'll add him to medical screening. Everyone gets checked. Lice, TB, malnutrition, standard procedure." Standard procedure, however, moved slowly. Days passed. The camp settled into its routine. Prisoners were assigned barracks, issued bedding, fed, counted, and counted again. The Kansas heat pressed down relentlessly, turning canvas roofs into ovens and draining energy from both guards and captives alike. Klaus shared a barrack with his father and dozens of other prisoners. Iron cots lined the space, canvas walls trapping the heat. During the day, children improvised games with dust, wire, and scraps of wood. At night, the camp fell quiet, except for the sound of wind moving through the grass and the distant calls of guards changing shifts. Klaus said little about his arm. He bore the pain the way children often do when adults seem powerless to fix it, silently, without complaint, as if enduring it were simply part of the rules. His father noticed everything: the stiffness, the way Klaus avoided using his right hand, the way his fingers curled tighter when the arm was bumped or brushed. He requested medical attention during processing, then again the next day. Guards nodded, notes were taken, promises were made. Still, nothing happened. 3 days passed before Klaus was finally summoned to the medical tent. When the guard arrived at the barrack and called their names, relief and fear twisted together in the father's chest. He took Klaus's left hand gently. "Come, they will help you now." The medical tent stood at the northeast corner of the camp, its canvas walls staked tightly against the Kansas wind. Inside, the air smelled of iodine and warm fabric. Light filtered through the cloth, illuminating folding tables, bandages, and metal instruments laid out with quiet precision. James Holland was waiting. When the boy stepped into the tent, his right arm still held protectively against his body, Holland felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct that told him this was not routine. Some injuries announced themselves loudly. Others waited patiently, burning beneath the surface.
Klaus had not been injured in Kansas. The damage to his arm belonged to another place, another moment, far from the quiet wheat fields now surrounding him. It began months earlier in Italy, during the slow collapse of German positions under relentless Allied pressure. His father, Friedrich, was 42 years old, a career officer who had joined the German army in 1935, back when the future still felt orderly and predictable. He had served in Poland, then France, then North Africa. Each campaign had begun with confidence and ended with retreat. By the time the war reached Italy, certainty had been replaced by endurance. In 1943, while Friedrich was deployed, his wife died in Hamburg during a firebombing raid. Klaus was not with her. He had been sent to relatives in the countryside and survived. The flames took his mother, but spared him. When Friedrich learned of her death, the war stopped being abstract. It became personal, immediate, and irreversible. Against regulations, but with quiet tolerance from his superiors, Friedrich arranged for his son to join his unit in Italy. It was an irregular decision, but 1944 was a year when rules bent under the weight of too much loss. Klaus traveled with the regiment for months, sleeping near supply trucks, eating when food was available, learning early how to stay quiet when the sky filled with aircraft. The injury happened during an evening meal. The regiment had paused near a supply vehicle when an Allied bombing run caught them unexpectedly. The explosion tore through the area with no warning. Klaus was thrown through the air, landing hard. He woke in confusion and pain. His right forearm burned and blistered, the skin angry and red. The regimental medic did what he could. There were no hospitals, no operating rooms. Supplies were scarce and constantly moving. The wound was treated with sulfa powder, bandages, and morphine. The priority was survival, not long-term recovery. Soldiers with arterial bleeding and chest wounds came first. A child whose arm was burned but still intact was pushed to the back of the line. The burns healed, but they healed badly. Thick scars formed, rigid and tight, pulling against muscle and tendon. The skin lost its flexibility. The fingers began to curl inward, their movement restricted. Worse than the stiffness was the sensation that never left. A deep, persistent burning. Not the sharp pain of a fresh wound, not something that faded with time. This pain lived beneath the skin. It flared whenever the arm was touched, brushed, or pressed. Months passed. The burning remained. By the time Klaus and his father were captured near Normandy and transported to the United States, the injury was already old, 4 months old, long past the point when healing should have completed. But the pain had never stopped. In Camp Concordia, Klaus adapted to captivity with the strange resilience of children. He found ways to play with dust and scraps of wire. He learned games that required only one hand. He watched other children and copied their movements carefully, adjusting without complaint. At night, when the barracks quieted, his father noticed how Klaus held his arm close to his chest, protecting it even in sleep. Friedrich worried constantly. He had requested medical attention repeatedly during processing. Each time, guards nodded. Clipboards were marked. Someone would look at it, they said. Soon. Soon stretched into days. Klaus did not cry. He did not ask when help would come. He had learned during months of war that pain was often something to be endured rather than solved. When he finally entered the medical tent on the 4th day, he carried that lesson with him. James Holland noticed it immediately. The boy sat carefully on the wooden chair, injured arm held tight against his body, eyes fixed on the instruments laid out on the table. Bottles of antiseptic, scissors, bandages, metal tools that gleamed softly in the filtered light. Holland crouched down until he was eye level with the child. He had learned during 2 years of combat medicine that children responded better when doctors made themselves smaller. "I'm going to look at your arm," he said slowly, using gestures to help bridge the language barrier, pointing to his eyes, then to the arm. "Just look, no hurt yet." Klaus glanced at his father. Friedrich nodded. The boy extended his right arm slowly, carefully, as if offering something fragile and easily broken. The damage was immediately visible. The skin of the forearm was scarred in thick rope-like ridges. Patches of pink and white interrupted the natural tone of the flesh. The pattern suggested blast exposure rather than flame, irregular damage caused by pressure and heat moving through the air. But what concerned Holland most was not the appearance, it was the way the tissue looked wrong. Too rigid, too extensive, too angry for something that was supposed to be healed. Holland leaned closer, careful not to touch yet. Beneath the scarred surface, he could see faint discoloration that suggested the problem ran deeper than skin. "I need to touch it," he said gently, maintaining eye contact with the child. Klaus nodded once. When Holland's fingertips made the lightest contact with the scarred skin, the reaction was immediate. The boy's entire body went rigid. His breath caught. Tears filled his eyes, though he made no sound. "It burns when you touch it," Klaus whispered. Friedrich translated quietly. Holland pulled his hand away at once. He had felt enough. The skin was warm, hotter than it should have been, and beneath his fingers, the texture had felt wrong, not like mature scar tissue, but something softer, unstable, as if the body were fighting an enemy it could not expel. Burns this old should not behave like this. Something else was happening beneath the scar, and Holland knew it.
James Holland had learned to read pain long before he ever arrived in Kansas. At Anzio, pain had announced itself violently, through shrapnel, blood loss, and men screaming for help under fire. Here, in Camp Concordia, it appeared more quietly, in the way someone moved, in what they protected, in what they avoided saying. When Klaus recoiled at the lightest touch, Holland felt a familiar tightening in his chest. It was the same instinct that had warned him years earlier that a wound was worse than it looked. The kind of instinct that came not from textbooks, but from hours spent watching bodies fail and recover in unpredictable ways. He sat back on his heels, thinking. Burns that old should not still produce heat. They should not cause this level of pain from simple contact. Something was wrong. "How long has it been like this?" Holland asked, speaking slowly, keeping his voice calm. Friedrich translated quickly, conferring with his son in German before answering. 4 months, since Italy. It healed, but the burning never stopped. Holland nodded, absorbing the information. 4 months.
long enough for proper healing, long enough for scar tissue to mature, too long for this kind of reaction. "I need to clean it properly," Holland said. "Really look at what's happening underneath." He paused, then continued, choosing honesty over comfort. "It's going to hurt." He explained through Friedrich that he would give Klaus morphine first, enough to dull the pain but not erase it entirely. He did not promise that it would be painless. He had learned early that false reassurance was its own kind of cruelty. Klaus watched the morphine bottle with wide eyes. He recognized it. He had received it before, during the original treatment in Italy. He knew what it meant: relief first, followed by pain significant enough to justify it. Holland prepared the syringe with practiced efficiency. He found a vein in the boy's uninjured arm, depressed the plunger slowly, and withdrew the needle. 10 minutes, he said. We'll wait. They sat in silence as the medication took effect. Outside the tent, the camp continued its routine. Guards changed shifts. Prisoners gathered for the evening meal. The Kansas wind pressed against the canvas walls, carrying dust and heat with it. Inside, a 7-year-old boy sat with his father's hand resting on his shoulder as morphine spread through his bloodstream, easing the constant tension that had lived in his body for months. When Klaus's breathing slowed and his posture softened, Holland nodded. "Okay," he said. "Let's see what we're dealing with." He worked carefully, using warm water and gauze to soften the scarred tissue. This was not rushed work. Every movement was deliberate, measured, respectful of how fragile the situation was. At first, nothing seemed unusual beyond severe scarring. Then Holland stopped. He set his instruments down and leaned closer, his expression tightening. Embedded within the tissue were fragments, metal fragments, small pieces, irregularly shaped, buried deep beneath layers of scar and inflamed muscle. Shrapnel, remnants of the original explosion that had never been removed. Too small to be obvious during the chaos of battlefield treatment, too numerous to be harmless. Holland felt his stomach sink. The body had tried to protect itself, encapsulating the fragments in pockets of inflammation, but the metal remained. With every movement of the arm, the fragments shifted slightly, grinding against tissue, creating heat, pain, and ongoing damage. Worse, some of the fragments were migrating. The body's natural processes were slowly pushing them outwards, creating new internal wounds as they traveled. One piece lay just beneath the surface, visible through scarred skin like a dark seed waiting to break through. Holland had treated shrapnel wounds before. He had pulled metal from soldiers in aid stations behind the front lines, hands slick with blood, working against time. But never in a child. Never in tissue this young, this determined to heal around something that did not belong. "There's metal in there," Holland said quietly. Friedrich's face went pale. Shrapnel, multiple pieces, embedded deep. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Friedrich asked the question that had been forming in his chest since Italy. "Can you remove it?" Holland met his eyes. "Yes," he said, "but not here, not like this." He explained that it would require surgery, real surgery, not field medicine, the kind of procedure that demanded time, instruments, and precision. It should have been removed months ago. Every day it stays in there, it causes more damage. Friedrich swallowed hard. "We had no facilities," he said quietly. "We were retreating. No hospitals, no equipment. The medic did what he could." Holland nodded. He understood. War forced choices no one wanted to make. A child's burned arm that wasn't bleeding did not outrank men dying in minutes from catastrophic wounds. "I'll need authorization," Holland said finally. "I'll have to talk to Major Daniels. This can't wait much longer." "How soon?" Friedrich asked. 2 days, maybe 3, Holland replied. "I'll push for 2. He looked at Klaus, still drowsy from morphine, his injured arm resting on the table as if separate from his body. "Tell him," Holland said softly, "that he's going to be okay." Friedrich translated. Klaus nodded, not fully understanding, but trusting because he had no other choice. Holland watched them leave the tent and felt the weight of the decision settling in. This was no longer a medical question. It was an ethical one, and it was about to collide with bureaucracy.
James Holland did not sleep much that night. He lay on his cot in the medic's quarters, staring at the dark canvas ceiling, replaying the feel of the tissue beneath his fingers, the warmth, the instability, the unmistakable presence of something that did not belong inside a child's arm. Shrapnel did not care about borders, uniforms, or age. It did what it was designed to do: tear, lodge, and remain. By morning, Holland had already made up his mind. He found Major Daniels in the administrative office, surrounded by papers, rosters, and the quiet chaos of running a camp that held hundreds of enemy soldiers. "I need authorization for surgery," Holland said, without preamble. Daniels looked up slowly. "Surgery? There's shrapnel embedded in a prisoner's arm, a child, multiple fragments. It's causing chronic inflammation. If we don't remove it, he'll lose function." Daniels exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "This sets a precedent." Holland had expected that response. "We have 600 prisoners here," Daniels continued. "Start doing surgeries for dependents? Where does it stop?" "It stops with this case," Holland replied evenly. "He's 7 years old. He's got metal in his arm. We either remove it or we watch the damage get worse." Daniels tapped his pen against the desk. "The Geneva Convention requires medical care for prisoners of war. The kid isn't a soldier. He's in our custody. That makes him our responsibility." The room fell quiet. Daniels studied him for a long moment. "This isn't an emergency room. We're not equipped for surgical work like this." "I know. That's why I'll requisition what we need." "And if something goes wrong?" asked Daniels. "If he loses the arm? If there's an infection? If this turns into a problem?" Holland did not raise his voice. "If something goes wrong because we tried to help, that's one thing. If something goes wrong because we did nothing, that's another." Daniels stared at him, weighing procedure against consequence. Finally, he reached for the authorization form. "Don't make me regret this," he said as he signed. Holland didn't respond. He was already thinking about what came next. The camp's medical tent had never been designed for surgery. It held examination tables, bandages, basic medications, nothing more. So Holland began to improvise. He contacted a nearby army hospital in Salina and requested surgical instruments. He requisitioned sterilization supplies. He hung additional canvas sheets to create the cleanest possible environment within the tent. Everything that could be boiled was boiled. Everything that could be cleaned was cleaned again. He recruited 2 assistants. Corporal Stevens had worked in a civilian hospital in Chicago before the war. He understood sterile technique and knew how to anticipate a surgeon's needs. Private Martinez had steady hands and a calm presence. He was assigned to manage instruments and monitor supplies. They worked without ceremony, without dramatics. This was not heroism, it was preparation. The surgery was scheduled for dawn on July 12, 1944. The timing was deliberate. Early morning offered the coolest temperatures before the Kansas heat turned canvas walls into ovens. Less heat meant less stress on the patient, fewer complications. Klaus was brought to the tent just as the sky began to lighten. His father walked beside him, silent, his face pale with worry. He had seen men go into medical tents during the war and not come out. Even now, safety felt uncertain. "You should wait outside," Holland said gently. Friedrich shook his head. "I stay." Holland nodded, then nodded. "Stand behind me. Don't interfere. If you need to leave, leave." "Understood."
Klaus was placed on the examination table. Holland administered anesthesia carefully, holding chloroform-soaked gauze over the boy's nose and mouth while counting down. At 6, Klaus's eyes fluttered closed. At dawn, in a quiet medical tent in the middle of Kansas, a surgery began that had nothing to do with victory or defeat, only with whether a child would be able to use his arm again.
The surgery lasted 3 hours. There was no dramatic announcement when it began, no countdown, no music swelling in the background, just the quiet efficiency of trained hands moving with purpose, aware that one mistake could alter a child's life forever. James Holland prepped the surgical site with iodine, the brown stain spreading slowly across scarred skin. He tested the scalpel's edge against his thumb, then made the first incision. The tissue resisted. Scar tissue always did. It was tougher, less forgiving, the body's attempt to seal damage it never fully understood. Holland worked carefully, cutting through layer after layer, following the signs his fingers gave him, subtle changes in resistance, texture, temperature. The first fragment appeared quickly, a small piece of irregular metal, dull and dark, embedded in inflamed tissue. Stevens handed him forceps without being asked. Holland removed it and dropped it into a metal tray. The fragment made a sharp clink against the steel. One down. There were more. Each piece required patience. Some fragments lay shallow, trapped just beneath scar tissue. Others had migrated deeper, pulled inward by muscle movement and time. Holland followed their paths methodically, widening incisions only when necessary, constantly aware of the structures beneath, muscle fibers, blood vessels, nerves. This was not battlefield medicine. There was no urgency measured in seconds, no hemorrhaging artery demanding immediate control. Instead, there was precision, deliberate restraint, the kind of work that required ignoring fatigue and focusing on millimeters. Behind him, Friedrich stood motionless. He watched without fully understanding what he was seeing, only that metal was being removed from his son's arm, piece by piece. Each fragment placed in the tray represented something that had been inside Klaus for months, burning him from within. At one point, Friedrich's breath caught. Holland did not look up, but he heard it. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Friedrich said, though his voice wavered. "Continue." The most dangerous fragment was buried deepest. It lay close to the radius bone, lodged near the path of the radial nerve. Damage there could mean permanent loss of function, paralysis, a lifetime of limitation. Holland slowed even further. He dissected around the fragment carefully, clearing inflamed tissue, exposing the metal without disturbing what surrounded it. Sweat formed beneath his collar, but his hands remained steady. When he finally grasped the fragment with forceps, it resisted, held in place by the body's attempt to wall it off. Then it came free. The piece was larger than the others, nearly half an inch long, jagged. When Holland dropped it into the tray, it landed beside 7 smaller fragments already removed. 8 pieces of metal. 8 reasons a child had lived in constant pain. "That's the last one," Holland said quietly. Friedrich exhaled a sound that was part relief, part grief. Months of fear and helplessness released in a single breath. Now came the closing. Holland irrigated the wound thoroughly, flushing away debris and blood. He sutured in layers, deep tissue first, then muscle, then skin. Each stitch was deliberate, placed to encourage proper healing and minimize scarring. When he finished, Klaus's arm was wrapped in clean white bandages, the surgical site hidden beneath gauze and tape. Holland stepped back and removed his gloves. "He'll sleep for another hour. When he wakes, there will be pain. I'll manage it, but the burning, that should be gone." Friedrich stared at his son's bandaged arm. "Thank you," he said in heavily accented English. Then he spoke again in German, more words spoken quickly, emotion breaking through his composure. Holland did not understand the language, but he understood the tone. Gratitude mixed with something heavier, the discomfort of owing one's enemy a debt that could never be repaid. Klaus woke later that afternoon. The pain was intense, different from before, sharp, surgical, immediate. Holland explained through Friedrich that this pain meant healing, not damage. The distinction meant little to a 7-year-old, but Klaus listened anyway. Morphine was administered carefully. His breathing remained steady. His color stayed good. For 3 days, Klaus remained in the medical tent. Holland changed the bandages twice daily, watching closely for signs of infection, fever, redness, swelling. None appeared. The sutures held. The tissue looked healthy. On the 3rd day, Holland touched the skin near the surgical site. Klaus did not flinch. "Does it burn?" Holland asked. Friedrich translated. Klaus paused, concentrating, testing the sensation honestly. Then he shook his head. "No." Holland nodded. "Good." The boy was returned to his barrack, but Holland insisted on daily follow-ups. Each morning, Klaus arrived with his father. The bandages were removed, the wound inspected, then rewrapped. Healing progressed quickly. Youth worked in their favor. Within a week, the sutures were removed. Within 2 weeks, the incision had closed into a thin red line. More importantly, the burning never returned. Klaus began using his right hand again, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. He could grip, he could throw a small ball, he could feed himself, dress himself, and join the other children in their improvised games. Holland watched this recovery with quiet satisfaction, not because the surgery had been extraordinary. Any trained trauma surgeon could have performed it under proper conditions, but because it represented something rare, a moment when the machinery of war paused long enough to allow healing, a moment when an enemy uniform did not matter, a moment when a child's future was restored, not by victory, but by care.
By late summer, Camp Concordia had settled into a slower rhythm. August heat turned Kansas into a furnace. Work details were scheduled early in the morning and late in the evening. Midday belonged to shade, stillness, and conserving energy. Guards and prisoners alike moved carefully, as if the air itself demanded restraint. Klaus appeared at the medical tent every morning. At first, he came quietly, offering his arm for inspection, answering questions with short nods. But as days passed and healing progressed, something changed. His posture straightened, his movements grew more confident. The guarded seriousness that had marked him since his arrival began to loosen. The arm healed well. The scar thinned and faded from angry red to pale pink. Flexibility returned gradually. The fingers, once curled inward, began to open naturally. Klaus used his right hand without hesitation now, to carry small items, to play, to gesture when he spoke. James Holland watched this transformation with professional satisfaction and something more personal. He had seen many recoveries during the war. Few had felt like this. One afternoon, Klaus arrived at the medical tent carrying a small bundle wrapped in newspaper. He held it carefully, as if it might break. "For you," he said in heavily accented English. Holland looked up from his inventory work, surprised. "For me?" Klaus nodded. Holland accepted the package and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small wooden horse carved by hand. It stood only a few inches tall, but the detail was striking. The neck arched mid-gallop. The mane had been carved in individual strands. The legs were positioned as if frozen in motion. It was not a crude object made in haste. It was the result of hours of patient work. "Did you make this?" Holland asked. Klaus nodded. "My father teach me before."
Holland turned the horse over in his hands. The wood was smooth, worn by careful sanding. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. "This is too nice to give away," he said gently. Klaus shook his head firmly. "Gift for you. You make the burning stop." The words landed harder than Holland expected. He felt something shift in his chest, a mix of gratitude, sadness, and the uncomfortable awareness that this child had carried pain no one his age should ever know. "Thank you," Holland said quietly. "I'll keep it safe." Klaus smiled. It was the first genuine smile Holland had seen from him. Not polite, not cautious, a real smile, brief and unguarded, transforming his serious face into something almost carefree. Behind him, Friedrich had appeared at the tent entrance. Klaus said something in German, too fast for Holland to catch. "What did he say?" Holland asked. Friedrich hesitated, then translated. "He said you are a good doctor, better than the doctors in the German army, because you did not ask if he was worth healing before you healed him." The words struck with unexpected force. Holland did not respond immediately. Every patient is worth healing, he thought. That was the foundation of medicine, or at least it was supposed to be. "That's what being a doctor means," Holland said finally. "You help." Friedrich nodded, absorbing the statement as if it confirmed something he had long suspected but never heard spoken aloud. After they left, Holland placed the wooden horse on the shelf above his medical supplies. It remained there, a quiet reminder that care could cross any border. Weeks passed. September cooled the air. Prairie grass shifted from green to gold. News from Europe filtered into the camp through radios and newspapers. Allied forces advanced through France. German defenses collapsed in some sectors, reformed in others. Friedrich began writing letters. He wrote to his sister in Bavaria, to cousins in Hamburg, to anyone who might still be alive and reachable. He described their capture, the camp, his son's surgery. The American doctor removed metal from Klaus's arm, surgery our own medics could not perform during the retreat. The letters traveled slowly, if they traveled at all. Holland wrote letters too, to his mother in Kentucky, to his younger sister studying nursing in Louisville. He described the work briefly, focusing less on technical details and more on the ethical weight of military medicine. He wrote, "We treat them the same as our own because they are patients first." His mother replied with concern. "Be careful with your sympathies," she warned. "Remember what they did. Remember who started this war." Holland read the letter one evening as the Kansas sky turned orange and purple. He understood her anger. He did not argue with it. Instead, he wrote back about the wooden horse. He did not explain why it mattered. He suspected she would not understand.
By November of 1944, the war had entered a phase where endings were discussed more often than beginnings. Rumors moved through Camp Concordia with remarkable speed. Germany would surrender by Christmas, or it would fight until every city was rubble, or a secret weapon would reverse everything. No one knew which rumor to believe, so prisoners and guards alike settled into routines that made uncertainty bearable. Klaus continued to appear at the medical tent, though his visits had become brief. There was little left to monitor. The incision had healed into a thin, pale line. Strength had returned to his hand. The stiffness remained slightly, but it no longer limited him. His arm worked. That alone felt miraculous. James Holland noticed how Klaus used it now without hesitation, to hold tools, to pass objects, to carve small shapes from scraps of wood during long afternoons in the barracks. The child who once protected his arm instinctively now treated it as something normal again. Healing had become ordinary, and ordinary in wartime never lasted long. In mid-November, Holland received transfer orders. They arrived without ceremony, typed on standard military paper.
He was being reassigned to a combat hospital in France, replacing a surgeon killed during an artillery strike near Metz. He was to report within 72 hours. Holland read the orders twice, then folded the paper carefully. Camp duty was over. He requested one final day to complete patient handoffs and brief his replacement. Major Daniels approved, reluctantly. The camp ran on continuity. Departures were inconvenient. Word spread quickly. Klaus arrived at the medical tent that afternoon without being summoned. He stood quietly at the entrance, watching Holland pack supplies into crates. "You go?" Klaus asked in English. His vocabulary had expanded over the months, assembled from fragments picked up from guards, other prisoners, and sheer necessity. "Yes," Holland said. "New assignment, Europe." Klaus processed the information in silence. Then he nodded slowly. "You see Germany?" he asked. "Maybe. Probably." Holland knelt down until they were eye level, the same way he had months earlier during their first examination. "Your arm looks good," he said. "Keep it clean, use it. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't work." Klaus extended his right hand. "Thank you for fixing." Holland took the small hand carefully, testing its grip without meaning to. It was strong, normal, flexible. The surgery had worked. Behind them, Friedrich waited outside the tent. He had given his son space to say goodbye alone. When he stepped inside, he extended his hand to Holland. They shook, enemy soldier and American medic, connected by circumstances neither had chosen. "You saved his arm," Friedrich said in careful English. "Maybe saved his future." "I was doing my job," Holland replied. Both men understood that this was only partly true. There were many ways the situation could have ended differently. Indifference, delay, procedure. None of those would have required effort. After Holland left Camp Concordia, the war did not become gentler. He served through the winter of 1944 in France, treating casualties during the Battle of the Bulge. He worked long hours under conditions that made Kansas feel impossibly distant. He saw injuries that could not be repaired, losses that could not be undone. He kept the wooden horse wrapped carefully in cloth inside his medical kit. Sometimes, during brief pauses between casualties, he would take it out and hold it, not as comfort, but as reminder that healing was possible somewhere in the world, even if it was not possible everywhere. The war ended in May of 1945. Holland was in Germany by then, assigned to a field hospital in Stuttgart. He treated German civilians alongside American soldiers. He watched a defeated population struggle with scarcity, occupation, and shame. Occasionally, he wondered about Klaus and Friedrich. He never saw them again. After the war, Holland returned to Kentucky. He completed medical school using the GI Bill, opened a family practice in Louisville, married, and raised 3 children. He practiced medicine for nearly 40 decades. The wooden horse sat on his desk the entire time. Patients asked about it. He never gave a long explanation. "It was a gift," he would say. In Germany, Klaus grew up. He attended school in Bavaria. He learned mathematics and engineering. His right hand never limited him. The scar faded into the creases of adulthood. He became precise, methodical, skilled with tools that required steady hands. His father lived quietly, working as a school teacher after the war. He spoke little about his military service, but he kept one photograph, a blurred image of a medical tent in Kansas. On the back, in neat handwriting, he wrote a simple note. "Here, my son's arm was healed. Here, I learned Americans could show mercy." Years passed. In 1982, Holland received a letter forwarded through a veterans organization. It was written in careful English. "I was 7 years old in Camp Concordia. You removed metal from my arm. You stopped the burning." Klaus had become an engineer. His hands worked perfectly. He had children of his own. His father had died years earlier, but had asked him to find the doctor if possible. Holland read the letter 3 times. Then he wrote back. They exchanged Christmas cards for years after that, updates about children, careers, ordinary lives built slowly after extraordinary disruption. When Holland died in 1997, the wooden horse passed to his oldest son. Camp Concordia had long since closed. The fences were removed. The land returned to farming. Wheat grew where prisoners once waited for the war to end. But the effects of what happened there had not disappeared. They had simply moved forward in time.
History often remembers war through outcomes, victories, defeats, borders redrawn, dates that mark beginnings and endings. But those markers rarely capture what war actually does to the people caught inside it, especially the ones who never chose to be there. For Klaus, the war took his mother, his home, and his childhood certainty. It followed him across continents and deposited him, injured and silent, into a prisoner of war camp thousands of miles from where the conflict began. It burned into his arm and stayed there long after the explosion had faded into memory. For James Holland, the war had already left its mark: a damaged leg, a reassignment away from the front, a daily confrontation with pain that no uniform or ideology could fully explain away. What happened in Camp Concordia did not change the course of the Second World War. No offensive was delayed, no treaty altered, no battle won or lost because of it. But something else happened, something quieter. A child stopped hurting. A future that could have narrowed into limitation opened back up again. A hand that might never have functioned properly was restored. And in the process, 2 people on opposite sides of a global conflict encountered a version of humanity that war tries very hard to erase. Decades later, Klaus would describe his life not in terms of what had been destroyed, but in terms of what had been repaired. He became an engineer. He built things with precision. He raised children of his own. His right hand worked as well as his left, the scar barely visible, the pain entirely gone. Holland spent nearly 40 years practicing medicine. He treated thousands of patients. Most of them never knew about the child in Kansas or the wooden horse on his desk. But the lessons stayed with him, reinforced over decades. Healing, when possible, is always worth attempting. Not because it redeems the past, not because it balances the scales of justice, but because it affirms something basic and stubbornly human: that pain deserves response, regardless of who carries it. Camp Concordia closed in 1946. The barracks were dismantled, the fences removed. Wheat grew where prisoners once waited for the war to end. Nothing on the land today explains what happened there. But stories like this do not disappear when places do. They move forward in time, carried by people whose lives were altered in ways no official record ever fully captured. The war taught Klaus what humanity could destroy. A doctor taught him what humanity could repair. Both lessons mattered. Both were true. Historical note: some dialogue in this video has been dramatized and reconstructed for narrative clarity. These moments are based on documented historical context, medical practices of the period, and first-hand style narrative reconstruction, but they do not claim to be verbatim transcripts. The events, setting, and outcomes remain faithful to historically plausible realities of World War II and prisoner of war medical treatment. If this story added something meaningful to your understanding of history, leave a like. It helps more people find content like this. Comment below with your thoughts or questions. I read them all. And if you want more carefully researched stories where history meets humanity, subscribe to the channel. Because some truths don't shout, they heal.